Welcome, everybody. My name is Eungie Joo, and I'm a curator based in San Francisco who's had the great privilege to work with many of the people, or at least admire many of the people who are honored by the Art Basel Awards. And so I really want to express my gratitude to my fellow medalists and also to Art Basel for this recognition, which is really meaningful to be with my colleagues here. Shanay Jhaveri and Candice Hopkins, as I told them in person, are two curators that if you ask me to nominate curators who are doing the most important work in the field right now, they would definitely be there. And I feel very fortunate to have been following them for a while now. And so I'm going to start by, basically we're going to do a little bit of a conversation where I'm just going to put out a couple of questions and then they're going to respond. So I think what we wanted to start with was to think about, people always wonder what are curators, what do they do, where do they come from? And it's true that there are kind of traditional modes that people have become curators in the past, which has something to do with maybe training in art or curatorial practice more commonly lately. But I think my colleagues here have slightly different trajectories, and so I wanted to start with Candice and just ask if you could talk a little bit about your journey to work in the field of art and culture the way you do now.
Thanks. It's a great question. I didn't come through a traditional path. I grew up in, if anyone knows Canada, I grew up in Yukon, which I always say to Americans is beside Alaska, because they don't know where the Yukon is, mostly. And then along the Alaska Highway. And so I decided to go to art school without ever having stepped foot in a museum or a contemporary gallery. So it was a bit of a leap of faith, I guess. So I did go to art school. But it was really a year of exchange that I did in the UK in 97, 98, which was the year that Sensations was on at the Tate. And I was living at the time, going to art school in Birmingham, that I realized that not only being an artist was a viable career, but possibly making exhibitions was a viable career. So I went back home, and then worked actually in Indigenous nonprofits for a couple of years. One was a local friendship center where one day we received a fax, and the fax was advertising an internship in the South Pacific, and I had never seen the Pacific Ocean. So I wanted to go to Fiji, of all places. So I applied, and I got an internship with another Indigenous organization called Wanamate. And it was dedicated to the work of Indigenous women plant knowledge keepers. And by chance, this organization, which is tiny, it still exists. It has one publication to its name that's also called Wanamate. They were invited to be a part of Expo 2000 in Hanover, Germany. So me, being the intern, was tasked with organizing this exhibition of their work. And it was amazing, because I talked to them about what they wanted to represent, how they wanted to represent it. And then over the dial-up internet, I discovered that there was a curatorial school, and the only one in the US at the time was at Bard College. So I applied. And I learned later that it was Thelma Golden who got me in, because I couldn't understand how an artist who then was working for Indigenous nonprofits could somehow be a curator. So that was my route.
Thanks for that very kind introduction, Eungie. And after we've spoken about our journeys, you must tell us about your journey as well.
We'd need a few hours.
But so I was born in Bombay, Mumbai, India, and grew up there. And I think to this day, even though I've lived, I think, for decades away, but always visiting frequently, I still call it home. And so I did my undergraduate work at Brown University, where I concentrated in art semiotics and art history. And at that time, it was a really fertile moment for me. I was learning about cultural theory, film studies, other cultures, it was just a moment of great expansion for me. And while that was happening, I also felt this need to deepen parallelly my knowledge of Indian artistic traditions and its culture, not only what I had, assimilated as I was growing up there, but to learn about it more formally. And this kind of moving back and forth between these two parallel sensibilities, interests in various other things, and India and South Asia kind of toggled along and found their way into the projects that I would make soon after, research projects, books, film programs, all really looking at transnational practices, cross-cultural encounters, what does it mean for artists to work in different geographies, the ethics of collaborating with people in another space, what were the geopolitical circumstances that allowed for these exchanges. And as that was going along, I looked to friends and then, of course, poets and writers to help me formulate what the language would be, moving between and continued interest for the place and the region I come from, but other engagements that I kept finding myself drawn to. And a good friend of mine, Pradeep Dalal, who works for the Annie Warhol Foundation, he wrote this essay called A Bifocal Frame of Reference. And having this ability to keep many interests simultaneously in view. And in that, he quotes an Indian poet, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who talks about a multilingual imagination, the nature of a multilingual imagination, and that finding the language to talk about the way I was moving through the projects I was making really gave me this confidence to then make work more freely. And I didn't make an exhibition with objects till 2013, so fairly recently. And that was a project that was about, it was called Companionable Silences, and it was looking at female practitioners from non-Western countries who in the early to mid-20th century found themselves in Paris, but then would go back to their home countries and what that journey would mean for them. And then following that, I continued to, do my PhD and independent work, but then for the last now 10 years, I've been working in public institutions, first at the Met for 6.5 years from 2016 to 2022, and then now the Barbican for the last 2.5 years.
I'll just give a short version, a very short version. I studied African diaspora studies with an emphasis on politics and literature as an undergraduate, and then thought that I would become a high school teacher. So I moved to San Francisco to study to become a teacher, and realized that the kind of anti-intellectualism of public school teacher education was not going to match what my aspirations were. And I had a great friend who taught me that probably through, if I went and got a PhD, I could probably just write the curriculum that needed to be in front of the young people that what we wanted to teach them. So I ended up going to graduate school in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley, entering with an emphasis on looking at what was then considered the Black Korean conflict in the United States after the Big Apple riots and the uprising in Los Angeles after the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of the police officers on LAPD. But I couldn't do that either. So I had this aversion to being able to prove historical information that was not anywhere in writing, right? So I needed to step away from there, and I had simultaneously become free family labor for my brother, the artist Michael Joo, as all good immigrant families do, and was by proximity, allowed into this very contemporary art world of artists, actually, and super young gallerists who were just establishing their galleries in Soho at the time and whatnot. So I was very lucky because I'm somebody who grew up not knowing there was a job called a curator, even though I went to the Walker Art Center regularly, or the Minneapolis Institute of Art and Design. But once I found that through a singing room, they call noraebang, a singing room in Korea during the first Gwangju Biennale in 1995, where Kathy Halbreich was the North American curator. I was told by her that they had the best art, curatorial art internship in the country, so that's the beginning of my path. So I switched over. And because of that relationship, I always tried to express my indebtedness to my brother, because I think what my brother taught me was that to be a visual artist is to offer to the world your ideas and your vulnerability in such a profound way. And it's really informed my practice as a curator, trying to do what I can to support artists at whatever stage they are, but often artists who are not considered in the so-called mainstream of art history. I thank you for introducing yourselves as such, because it might seem that these things happen really naturally, that we kind of end up here on a stage together, but in fact, it's such a circuitous route. And I think it's so interesting to me, because Candice, over the last few days, I've gotten to hear a little bit more about your journey that you didn't talk about so much, but that you have this great experience with biennials, which is such an important form. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe how those temporary, almost festival-style projects informed what you do now, which is work, and maybe you could speak about that in relation to Forge Projects, where that you co-founded.
Yeah, thanks, Eungie. One thing that resonated with me with what you just said is part of the reason that I wanted to become a curator is because I didn't see the realities that I had lived as a First Nations person from Canada being represented at all. And I saw exhibition making as a form of knowledge making. But in terms of biennials, so part of how I've come to work on so many, and I think that I've worked on 8. So it's a lot of biennials. 3 Site Santa Fe biennials, 2 Toronto biennials, Venice Biennale, Documenta, advised on others, is that I have to say I have a deep distrust of institutions. And I say that not with any guilt, because I feel like, perhaps because I started as an artist, I felt like I didn't want to have to be a ventriloquist for any other body except my own. So I've always worked independently until very recently, and biennials actually are an institution, but they're a very temporary one. And the first one that I worked on was Site Santa Fe, 2014, then 2016, then came back again in 2018, as a series of interrelated exhibitions. So the exhibition in 2014, which was co-curated with Lucia San Roman, who's based again in Mexico City, was called Unsettled Landscapes. And it was looking at the history of the Americas. The Site Santa Fe Biennial at that time had kind of repositioned itself as a biennial of the Americas, and what that means. And what was remarkable about doing that project, where we had artists all the way from what we called Tierra del Fuego all the way to Nunavut, which is an indigenous territory in Canada, was that we thought that we were doing something extraordinary by kind of forging open history in a way. Not all audiences felt that way. And I remember the most critical review we received was from someone who normally writes for opera in a newspaper in Texas. And they said that the exhibition made them feel guilty. And I thought, well, maybe this is the first time you felt guilty, and that's not a bad thing. But then through working on biennials, I realized that it's a really salient way to kind of think about the kind of layers of place, let's call it. So the last one that I worked on together with Ruba Katrib and Jose Luis Blondet was called Casa Tomada. And many of you probably know that short story, which is pretty incredible. I think it was written in the 1920s, and it kind of means house taken over, or house under the influence. And so we were thinking a lot at the time of not just borders, but how to think about who belongs, who doesn't belong, but who's actually setting those conversations and those discourses, which is very salient for now. And I would say that the most incredible thing that we were able to do with that biennial as a platform was to bring, it was a smuggling operation, actually, like a real one. So in 1997, a foot from a conquistador sculpture was severed by someone who I believe is an artist who's remained anonymous. And it's been fascinating to me ever since then. It was the conquistador Juan de Oñate, who was incredibly violent towards local indigenous people. And I've thought about that act ever since I moved to New Mexico. And then all of a sudden, the foot that had been severed, it was the right foot, appeared in the New York Times, because the foot thief had reappeared in New Mexico, and he was talking to the film director, Chris Eyre. And as soon as I saw that, I knew we had to get that foot, because that foot was taken from just north of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the biennial is. So I contacted the film director, who I know, and I said, I know that this person needs to remain anonymous because this is still a federal crime, but we really need that foot. So he actually smuggled it in a black bowling bag through the back of the gallery. We released all the staff so that they weren't liable, and we got the foot. But then we realized, too, that it was still a federal crime, so we made a cast of micaceous earth. So I think this is what biennials can do, is they can do things that often could be a liability for other kinds of institutions, but they also allow you to work alongside artists to do, I think, still works that wouldn't be realized otherwise. And this is what I've tried to do through biennials, is work with artists who often don't have any commercial representation, still do not, but they're amazing artists, to do incredible work to try to change the canon.
And Shanay, I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about, your work through film performance and exhibition making, because even though, as you say, it's relatively recent that you made your first traditional exhibition, it's been furious. And I mean, if anybody saw Purple Hibiscus, you know that, Shanay decided to go for it, just like everything on the table. So if you could talk a little bit about that work.
Unlike Candice, I've spent the last decade working in institutions. And two quite different ones. The first, the Met, established in 1870, very much informed by a 19th century view of the prestige of being the holder of the world, this universal encyclopedic institution that will bring things from everywhere else and hold them. And then now a multi-art center formulated in the mid-20th century, born out of the Second World War, with the purpose of creating a civic space where you can have access to all the arts. But in both, there are inherent hierarchies, and their institutional histories are very particular. So in both institutions, what I felt I was participating in at the Med, and even now at the Barbican, is really, along with other colleagues and now my team, is rethinking the foundations and trying to understand what can be done by close study and analysis of these spaces that are celebrated, venerated, and are homes for people where they go to educate, enjoy, reflect. And that study and analysis of the institution would lead to thinking about, not for the Met, not just what's on the walls and acquiring, because representation and recognition is important, and that has to be consistent. It can't be that you buy and it's not seen. So while I was at the Met, for all those 6.5 years, it was about ensuring that what was acquired was seen, and seen in various ways, in various contexts, and across various, registers. So as you were saying, through film, or whether it's public programming or performance, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in a moment. But it's also knowing that the work doesn't end there, and gauging or pushing or challenging the institution to recognize that it's a social institution, and that the acquiring and making exhibitions is one part of it. Are you creating the space for the audiences that you're now putting the work up for, who haven't seen themselves there? And being the first incumbent curator with a focus on South Asia for the Met, they'd never collected really work from that region. So how do you author that? And making the institution realize that it has to be modest and humble. It's arriving at a conversation that is robustly happening in the region with newer institutions, newer collectors, newer foundations. And it can't make what it would think is that comprehensive collection. It is going to be full of gaps, and we have to acknowledge those gaps and think of other strategies. And at the Barbican, and the other thing that kind of cuts across both is, so beyond thinking about the collection and the legacy, it's also about interrogating the spatial arrangement of these places, and then how that spatial arrangement and its architecture, its physical being, also determines how people read and understand the art and the narrative that they see there. And so I did a couple of commissions at the Met around the building, which challenged the building, and the artists worked through with the collections and reimagined it. But I think the project I really want to talk about in this context is a performance project that we did with Nikhil Chopra, an Indian artist who lived at the Met for 9 days consecutively and walked around the museum making drawings, setting up where he would stay and eat. But as he did, he was moving through the geography of the world as imagined by the Met. And his nomadic being, in a way, brought, I thought, into relief the arbitrariness of the organization of the world by this institution. And so I think it was an incredibly complicated logistical project, but it also involved so many different departments and people from across the museum, from security to the conservators to the people who clean the galleries, and they all became participants in it, which was really amazing. And then to carry that spatial interrogation of museums and art centers, we've been doing commission-based work at the Barbican, and Purple Hibiscus being one of the biggest statements we've made in that regard, where we invited Ibrahim Muhammad to respond to the institution. And what he was really drawn to was the textured concrete that defines the Barbican. And that was bush-hammered by a group of 14, 15 men whose labor is unacknowledged. And so he wanted to make a work that would layer itself on top of that, but which was assembled by hand which was 300,000 square meters of cotton fabric, stitched by artisans in northern Ghana. And on top of that would be these batakaris, which were handed down through families, be embroidered on top of it. So it's about ancestral knowledge, it's about intergenerational conversations, but it's also about celebrating labor and collectivity. So those are ways in which I've tried to kind of work outside of the conventional exhibition format, but then also using the conventional exhibition format to interrogate the museums and the art center.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go straight, because you mentioned the project of Nikhil Chopra, and as you were discussing it just now, I was thinking that's so beautiful, the connection between Nikhil and then your recent exhibition, The Imaginary Institution, because in a way it's that, right? It's a continuation of that exploration, and really, I think, putting in place these different tenets that you're discussing about the experience of the spatial experience, the historical narrative, and even within, let's say, a narrative of Indian modernism, who has been included and excluded. So, a lot of things that you could maybe do more fluidly in London than you could do in Bombay. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that wonderful exhibition.
Thank you. So the show that Eungie is talking about is the Imaginary Institution of India, Art 1975 to 1998, which we had at the Barbican in the fall of 2024. And it was the first show at the Barbican to look at modern and contemporary Indian art. But what had struck me was when I moved back to England was that it had been, I think since the 1980s, really, there hadn't been a major exhibition devoted to work from India. There had been monographic shows, there had been smaller shows that looked at the region as a whole, but nothing that brought 30 artists together and 150 works, and really also talking about the developmental journey of the nation beyond partition, which is very significant and hugely has defined the reality of the region, but also for where we are now, the pivotal years of 75 on to 98, and how, after the spirited moment of nation building, when democracy and the idea of nationhood and civil rights were threatened in India, and how artists responded to it across different registers, and also the notion of how someone holds the nation or the nation state is so varied amongst these different modes of representation. And I hope that the show, while speaking to the specificity of India in that moment, would also engage engage audiences more broadly who are seeing some of those negotiations actively in the world we live in today. And in fact, the show opened when the show was on when what was happening in America, and there was a friend who said there was a painting by Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh called "How Can You Sleep Tonight?" and it's this nocturnal painting about this couple who's trying to sleep, and they're at the bottom part of the painting, and at the top, and then all around them, it's this chromatic universe, but there's so much going on within it. And she said that it just was exactly what resonated with her. With confronting what was happening in America. So I felt that that was a really incredible testament to the power of these works, and also for those artists. And I'll wrap up very quickly. It was amazing to bring many of them to London while the show was going on, and for them to see their works, some which they had not seen in 20, 30 years, in a different context, in conversation with other works, but also seeing people relate to it in ways they had never imagined, because they were making them as form of maybe protest or a celebration of friendship and community, and to see it live expansively elsewhere was what was really gratifying for me.
Thank you. Candice, I'm going to give you our last question, and we might end up going 1 or 2 minutes over, but only that. I think the impact that you've had in your career, your recent career, has been really profound. And I think notably your recent exhibition, Indian Theater, let me say the whole title, Native Art from the 1950s to Now, is an example of one of the major contributions that you've made, which has to do with really rethinking how we place an emphasis on contemporary art and think about indigeneity. And when I was, before this talk, I was kind of surfing the internet, and I came across an exhibition that you had done. I don't know where it originated, but Art for a New Understanding. And I thought, that kind of attitude, plus all your other work, I think is so important that you have express a kind of cultural continuity, which I think that's why you were such an important applicant to Thelma, I'm guessing. Because you had the cultural continuity by which contemporary art could be understood, because you were actually living in contemporary artistic production.
Thanks, Eungie. I'm thinking about how to respond because it's a really beautiful question. So Indian theater, which there were some images circulating of that exhibition, Indian theater, performance art and self-determination since 1969 originated at the Hessel Museum at Bard College, where I now teach, where I went to school, in 2024, and it's touring. It's now on at the Mackenzie Art Gallery, and then we'll go to Site Santa Fe next year. And that started with a single document from 1969 and a single action from 1969. So in 1969, at the Institute of American Indian Arts, which is in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is under threat right now from the Trump administration to lose $13.5 million of their annual federal funding, just FYI. So that school started in 1963. But in 1969, under their inaugural director, Lloyd Kivanu, who was a Cherokee fashion designer and textile artist, he collaborated together with the director of the dance and theater program at the time and students. They commissioned for their new theater program an unknown designer at the time whose name is Paolo Soleri, who had not yet done Arco Santi. The theater at IAI was his first major work of architecture, and it was for Native students. And this document called Indian Theater, authored in 1969, which included scripts, started with a series of notes. And the notes were towards what they called an experiment in process. This is one of the first documents that I found where they're trying to define what new Native theater might be and what contemporary theater is now today. A few months later, this document was published in July. On November 10th, 1969, the self-called Indians of all tribes, that were all students at UC Berkeley at the time, decided to occupy Alcatraz Island. Alcatraz Island was recently decommissioned by the federal government. It was a prison. Trump wants to turn it into a prison again, but he kind of stopped talking about that because they realized that the reason it was decommissioned in the first place because it was too expensive to run. So they took it back to test Lakota Treaty, because under a Lakota Treaty that was signed in the late 1800s, all federal surplus land, of which Alcatraz was included, was meant to go back to Native people. So by occupying the island, people say that that was the beginning of what's called the self-determination era for Native people in the United States. They lobbied then-President Nixon to drop the Federal Indian Relocation Act, which was the largest federal land grab of Native lands at that time. They also negotiated to try to get Alcatraz Island to turn it into the first Native-run university called Thunderbird University, and their proposals are online. I think they still are good proposals. But what my question was with that exhibition was, if 1969, somehow there was this turn in self-determined Native education and theater and art, what I learned through the artist Pete Jemison, who witnessed the occupation of Alcatraz from the shores of San Francisco Bay, he said he knew he didn't want to get in the water because he saw that they were dressed in cowboy boots and jean jackets, so he didn't think they were going to make it. Anyway, what he told me was that he said, a lot of those students who were part of Indians of all tribes, they were also participating in radical street theater at the time. So Alcatraz was their stage. The proclamation that they wrote to the Great White Father, where they proposed to purchase Alcatraz Island for $24, red cloth, and strings of beads, similar to how Manhattan was supposedly purchased by the Dutch. That was all a script. So theater then becomes the basis for not only the self-determination era, but I argue in that exhibition, all art to follow that was made by Native artists. So my question is then, through the exhibition, how do things like adornment, start to be translated into painting? How does performance have its roots in this kind of moment of self-determination and agency, and how does this resonate now?
Thank you. I see we're 2 minutes and 57 minutes over. My apologies, Colleen. I want to thank you guys for sharing your incredible work and for doing your incredible work, and it's really an honor to be with you on stage.
Thank you, Eungie.
Thank you. Thank you, Shanay. Thank you, Candice. Thank you, Eungie. It was really wonderful to have you here. Super inspirational. So loads of work to be continued.